Welcome everyone to today's webinar where we will tackle the concept of companies in transition. Essentially, companies that are adapting their business strategies to align and compete in a low carbon economy. And our focus for today, the potential of this type of activity actually taking hold in Alberta's traditional energy sectors. And no doubt something the energy debate continues to grapple with. My name is Karen Perla. I'm director with the Energy Futures Lab and your moderator for today's discussion, where we will dive into the intersection of companies in transition and what's happening when you look at oil and gas and power and utility companies in Alberta. Otherwise, for today's purposes, we call them OGPU. I am joining you today from Amisquachi, Waskahikan, also known as Edmonton in Treaty 6 territory, a very vast and beautiful place that has and always will be the home to many Indigenous peoples and communities, and a place that many of us feel very proud to call home as well. We are now at that really special time of the year, full of long, luxurious, light-soaked time, where we all stay up late, way past our bedtimes, chatting and hashing out the big questions of the day, and with the energy conversation now really dominated and very much divided by what it means to be an energy superpower and what it will take. We think this concept of energy in transition or companies in transition really raises a number of big questions, like, is the carbon competitiveness of our traditional industries mission critical? What do the leading corporations of an energy superpower need to be saying and doing now more than ever? Right now, here, two things are very clear. Becoming an energy superpower means Alberta will have skin in the game. And in terms of what this will look like, we're not going to get consensus in a day or even in the next hour, this next power hour. So we must keep opening up spaces like these to have these types of conversations. And really, that's truly why the Energy Futures Lab decided to take this deeper look into companies in transition in its recent report, Walking the Talk, which really looks to examine the challenges facing corporate transition activity and understand if incremental gains are being made that can build a foundation for further and future progress. So that's the setup. But before we head into a panel conversation, just give me a few minutes to level set on the study itself. When we think of companies in transition and transition activity, it generally starts with corporate net zero commitments. The EFL report, Walking the Talk, looks to establish what I call a very honest view of where OGP and U, OGPU companies in Alberta, are in terms of taking actions to meet stated commitments on emissions reduction. And to be very clear, the purpose of the study was not to assess companies against each other. In a world where the role of oil and gas is possibly murkier than ever, the intent was really to identify how and even if companies are taking action. And of particular interest to us here at the lab, who might be those positive deviants, companies exhibiting uncommon behaviors? Because we know that there are deep-rooted challenges facing transition activity. So the question is, how might we build on what's working to nudge and promote uptake of transition activity by others in the sector? And equally as important for today's discussion is the question of whether or not we believe that this type of shift for fossil fuel-based companies is even really possible. So in terms of the approach and the findings that we developed through Walking the Talk, the study, it's important to be clear that the study does not introduce a new framework for assessing transition activity. What the approach is intending to do is to daylight where there is growing alignment in terms of what we would call, quote unquote, good transition activity, when you look at and across sustainability and climate reporting standards and transition and planning frameworks. Also important to note, only a handful of companies emerged as outliers or positive deviants, and all emerged for different reasons. But importantly, what makes them stand out from the herd is that they are taking steps and doing so without clear policy signals or strong investment incentives. And so yes, while the group is very alarmingly small, from the perspective of a positive deviance lens, it was important to understand what these first movers are doing that can lay the groundwork for broader adoption. And then finally, in terms of helping to promote leadership and uptake of transition activity in a world that will prioritize market-driven solutions, the study does focus on the role that policy can play to strengthen the enabling environment for these actors. So top notes for those considerations for your reference for today. 1, harmonizing emissions reporting standards, especially scope 1 and 2, to improve consistency. 2, supporting proactive internal capacity building for scope 3 disclosure across value chains as a strategic preparation effort. 3, incentivizing disclosure among suppliers, especially small and medium-sized enterprises. 4, aligning federal and provincial funding for low carbon infrastructure. 5, And finally, 5, promoting transition planning as a strategic planning tool, not just as a compliance effort. With that, I will now turn to our panel. We have 3 very thoughtful, very insightful, and brainy panelists with us today. Really really looking forward to the conversation. But instead of actually reading out their bios, I'm going to invite our panelists to introduce themselves. So we will now, panelists, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. If we could just go one by one, if you could share your name, the organization that you spend your time and energy with, and what you find exciting about companies in transition, we'll start the conversation that way. Jamie, maybe kick us off.
Sure. So thank you, Karen. So Jamie Bonham, I'm the head of stewardship at NEI Investments. We are a fund company that services retail and institutional clients with about 12 billion in assets under management, almost all of which is under a responsible investment mandate. And first of all, I just want to thank Colleen, Raylene, and Karen for the report. I think it's fantastic. I had a super short conversation about it early on in its gestation, so I'm basically a co-author, I think. No, just kidding. It's all them. It's fantastic. I'm excited about the idea of companies in transition, is that I think we have one of those rare moments to see disruption coming and we have time to plan for it. And so that's why I think the concept is worth discussing.
Thank you, Jamie, and welcome. And yes, you are a co-author now. Raylene.
Thanks, everybody. Tansini Totamak. I just said in my traditional language, which is Cree. Hello, my friends. It's great to spend some time with you all today, even though we can't see you. I just like to begin acknowledging that I'm an uninvited visitor on the waters of the Kalaman Nation. The Kalaman Nation is a Coast Salish nation whose territory spans along the northwest part of the BC's Sunshine Coast. And I just want to offer my deepest of gratitude to the nation for all their stewardship to sustain the beauty and the vitality of this place. My name is Raylene Whitford. I'm the director of CanNative Energy, alongside Colleen and a research team. Was very involved in the development of this report. I think what excites me the most about Companies Transition report is that the study goes beyond checklists. It really aims to reflect the complexity of transition work that's happening in Alberta today. And it also, I think, highlights the tension between incrementalism and systemic transformation. And as somebody who's worked alongside and inside some of these companies and who now critiques them in an academic setting, I am really interested in shining lights on the positive deviance, as Karen said, and just advancing the narrative of how perfection shouldn't be the objective, but the positive deviance is an honest kind of barometer of progress. Thanks.
Thanks, Raylene. Really great to have you back for this conversation. And really great to work with you on this study. Colleen, my friend.
Hi, Colleen Kaiser. Thanks for having me. I'm joining you all from Takaranto or Toronto. Was very happy to be involved with this work. My background is in climate change governance. Broadly speaking, I've been in that research space for just over 10 years, with just over 5 years at the Smart Prosperity Institute, where I'm now Director of Policy and Research. And that is a think tank based at the University of Ottawa, at the Institute of the Environment. I couldn't agree more with both what Raylene and Jamie said. I think for me, another really exciting piece of this work was the sort of methodological approach. Our framework, we spent a lot of time thinking how we could unpack this sort of tricky area. And I think it's laid a really good foundation for future iterations where we could sort of deepen and broaden our assessments, outside of OGPU, but certainly with more of these kinds of companies in transition.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, and welcome, Colleen. Thank you for that initial taster of today's conversation and the perspectives that you all bring. You've all touched on this piece of analysis in different ways, so why don't we just get going? How's that feel? Yeah, I thought we would just come out guns a-blazing with this first question, shall we? So the reason, in my opinion, that the title Walking the Talk perks our collective interest is we've just come through this this period where almost all companies were signaling that they were taking transition seriously by putting out commitments. Yet these signals we're seeing now say this isn't happening. Internationally, BP is a notable example. In 2020, they targeted a 20-fold increase in their renewable portfolio, and they've now announced that they are slashing more than 5 billion in planned clean energy investments. So I just want to start by unpacking whether the notion of an AUG-POO company actually diversifying or pivoting is off the table. Jamie, my friend, you want to tackle that one?
Indeed. So the answer clearly is no, sort of, and yes.
And everything in between.
Am I done, or do you want me to unpack that?
Maybe unpack that a bit more.
Okay, I'll unpack it a little bit more. So there is no fundamental law of physics that says companies cannot transition. The report shows that companies are already doing some of these actions that would be characterized a transition company. And I remain convinced that this is a viable path, that we do have this opportunity to see the transition coming and plan for it. As we've talked about before, worked for a number of years with companies around this idea of is there a diversification, a transition strategy that makes sense, knowing what's coming. That said, I think with a few exceptions, I no longer know if companies in this sector, and specifically Alberta-based companies, are going to be leading the transition. I think this is a story of resilience, and as opposed to driving transformation, which is maybe where I started on this path and thinking about where the industry could go. I think it is really more just about being resilient. I think transformation, disruption is going to come from outside the industry, like it probably always has. I think the difference that we have now with the energy transition, and what's different from, say, a Blockbuster or a Kodak or all the classic examples, is that we know it's coming, and we also have a sheer size and inertia in our system that means it's going to take some time, and so we have this time to plan should we choose to do so. I do think that sectors are a little different. Power and utilities probably makes there's more of a chance of really being leaders in driving transition, and I think that's going to be somewhat policy dependent. But I think there's definitely that possibility. But when we get to, as named in the report, the hydrocarbon actors, I think, I do think it's off the table for quite a bit of the industry, and really a viable transition path, nor any desire to find one. And I think we have to be creative around what that means, in terms of how do we approach that to address this, I think, risk of, is it going to be a ramp that an off ramp, or is it going to be a cliff that we run into? And I think the other side of that, which is more of a near-term consideration, and to be clear, I don't think demand's dying tomorrow and that the sector is like in danger right away. But notionally, this is where we're heading to. But I think what is more important in the near here and now is that if you do have an incumbent industry whose strategy is based on not just a steady demand, but an increasing demand, and that's your strategy, you are probably going to do what you can to ensure that future plays out. And that creates a real tension around the kind of policies that we need. And I think we have to be aware of that. So I'll leave it there.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you so much. I'm curious if I can put a finer point on the comments that you just made, a very sobering kind of reflection on the state of the sector. So knowing that the train is coming, knowing that most companies will be leading the way, how critical is that that companies actually meet their transition commitments?
I see it as pretty critical. I do think, and we're going to get into this, I think, in the rest of the session here, is that we probably have to, I guess, moderate our opinion of what that looks like, right? Like, what is acceptable? What kind of incremental gains are something to lock onto and really celebrate? It may not look like we thought it was going to look like 5 years ago, but I still think it is important, and I still believe that there is ample reason, and coming from the investment side, for companies to follow through on those commitments. And I do hope we'll get into a bit more of the details of what that looks like in this session, but I see it as still critical. I don't think we can pretend that everything is over. It's all guns a-blazing for oil and gas. 4 years from now, we could have an entirely different administration down south again and have an
Yeah.
entirely different scenario again. So
Really bring it back to that tension that Raylene named in our intros around incremental gains and transformational change. And so honing in on that, Colleen, you were part of the advisory team for the study. And so, as you know, and as the study confirms, a lot of the change that we're seeing is still very much incremental. Where do you sit on the spectrum on, are these important first steps or are they not nearly enough?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Karen. So I think there's often this sort of almost binary between incrementalism and transformative change, and I think that's probably the wrong way to look at it. Incremental changes can be really important, but they're certainly not enough. But that doesn't mean we should sit around cheerleading small incremental changes and say, "Yay, we're done," or just hold off and be looking for like a full transformation of a given company. I think we need to think about how these actually work together. So what we really want to see are incremental changes that sort of lay a foundation for more transformational changes in the future. Um, and usually that means you want to have incremental changes that are aligned or coordinated with a higher level strategic vision as opposed to sort of one-off incremental changes. But they can be important in terms of experimentation and learning, inducing cultural shifts and lessening resistance to change within a given company. They may end up resulting in some kind of innovation, process innovation, technological innovation that could lay the groundwork for potentially new paths that a company could take. Often when we're studying these things, we only are able to sort of identify what those important incremental changes were in hindsight, but we know that they exist. And so I think, something as simple as, adopting a process for starting transition planning at a firm. It doesn't mean you've committed to completely change your firm, but perhaps going through that process of actually getting foundational data and evidence, understanding your climate transition risks better, having conversations at a senior level, that could very well lay the foundation and the groundwork needed to actually act on more transformational changes. So I think in part of this study, we've really tried to tease out the sort of nuance in the incremental change and what are those incremental changes that can build the readiness or the capacity. If they're not a company in transition already, are they doing things that are setting themselves up to become one? If we think about Netflix, they used to mail out DVDs and now they're one of the biggest content creators in the world. That, of course, is a transformational change that, if we look under the hood, was built on a lot of tiny incremental steps. So I think we need to take a bit of a more long-term view, certainly not cheerlead just random incremental changes, but also not sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater and just say we're looking for, full diversification right out of the gate. There's nuance there.
Yeah. So really resisting that either or and like understanding how these, there is an important role for incremental change, but like the quality of that type of change really matters within the larger picture. Yeah. And so you've really spoken to like, this is what we would like to see. So if I can just pivot the conversation to what we're actually seeing happening in the sector right now, I would wager the three of us or the four of us on the call today, we would agree that we're starting to see growing alignment in terms of what strategic transition activity can look like. But it's hard to deny the retrenchment we've seen in the sector more recently. Okay, I'm seeing nods on the panel from the panel here. Okay, so I'm curious to hear from some of you your takeaways from that. So, Raylene, your work in many ways has given you a front row view to a number of things impacting transition activity. Including what clearly now is a rollback on climate reporting requirements in Bill C-59. Impacts of that occurred during the period of the study, and an event that really for many led to a protracted period of green hushing. Not the case across the board, but it was a challenge. From your perspective, how can even those actors who are prioritizing their oil and gas business benefit from sustainability and climate reporting? I'm looking like how can they win when it comes to public disclosure of this kind?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Karen. I had a nod of very much disappointment. This last year has been incredible in terms of kind of challenges coming out in assessing and even having corporates disclose sustainability related information. It was nearly a year ago when we were beginning the study that C59 came out, and over the period of a week, we saw many oil and gas and some power and utility companies pull their sustainability reports off their websites, and even some oil and gas companies, publicly listed oil and gas companies today, still have not put those reports back up. So um, I don't know if this is not this information is not being shared out of actual fear, or if it's a strategic way to put pressure on the federal government. Who knows? But I think C59 in particular was an important part of that change. We also have the CSA who have said that they are putting a pause on requiring any companies to provide climate-related reporting. So I think the structures of which we're working within right now are not conducive to the sharing of this information. But from a governance and competitiveness perspective, I don't think disclosing less will protect companies from anything. I think that it limits investor confidence, it undermines social license, and it just ignores the broader trend of transparency that we're seeing around the world. I think an oil and gas company, even if they are intent on doubling down on hydrocarbon production, I think that they can win by leading credible disclosures and not hiding from it. Um, I also want to acknowledge that disclosure is not the endpoint, or disclosure is the endpoint. Like, to be able to provide the market and the public with decision useful information, you need robust processes and data, and that takes time, that takes investment. We are no longer in a world where we're only using financial information to assess a company to invest in. So if you are not actively obtaining this information internally, I think that you are at a tremendous risk as a company. And I do want to acknowledge in the study, there was a reference towards Indigenous people's rights and interests. It was not included as part of the methodology in assessing a company in transition for various reasons. There was lots of things kind of moving at the point when we undertook the study. But that is also a very important part of assessing whether these companies are going to be resilient and innovative and sustain through this kind of wide sweeping change that we're seeing in the industry. So companies that are kind of on the back foot, digging in their heels and not providing this information, whether it's on Indigenous rights or climate related information, they're not just ethically out of step, they're exposing themselves to long-term risk. I'm of the view that we're collectively at a point where the companies can't continue to put their heads in the sands, and sustainability disclosure is one point or one part of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, like everything you've said, I think I would sum up in everything weighted. Transparency still gives you an edge in a number of different areas. There's still a business edge to being able to provide that type of information. And thank you for that reminder. Yes, the Indigenous dimension of a company in transition was something we very much were like trying to wrap into the study. And so we started with emissions, but there's so much more work that needs to be done in this space. Colleen, building on that, I'm curious. SPI, transition planning, it's obviously a focus area for your organization. Very interesting to consider that during the analysis period, while we identified 64 companies for analysis, only 16 were ultimately explored because of a number of things that Raylene just spoke to. Because they had a public-facing net zero commitment and had not yet pulled their sustainability reports. What are your observations from that?
Yeah, so I would echo all of Raylene's comments. I couldn't agree more, and maybe some complementary thoughts I would have on that. One would be, obviously, we needed some kind of a rule that said you're not just allowed to greenwash without repercussions. And I think that was an important step for the government to take, particularly, you know, even then there was sort of the beginnings of retrenchment starting. I think it really highlights, you know, so there was a lot of uncertainty that came out of that because companies weren't sure exactly if they were going to get penalized based on their external communications, their disclosures, etc. So I think it highlights from a governance perspective the need ideally for like a parallel development of a taxonomy to then allow companies to understand what counts as something that's green and transition alongside an enforcement rule. And I'm encouraged that the current federal government is planning on working on that. But I think if we look under the hood, and to sort of pull on your comments, Karen, around transparency giving a competitive edge, uh, there's sort of a line of thinking in organizational theory that if a lot of leading companies in a space are responding to a dynamic like the need to address climate change, risk mitigation, ESG pressures, that they'll just look to leading firms and sort of copy. They'll mimic what they're doing. So it's also very possible that a lot of the companies that ended up pulling their stuff were the companies who weren't really committed to these sustainability principles and integrating climate and other, sustainability considerations into decision making. That they weren't doing it because they saw it as a strategic advantage. They were doing it because they thought it's what they should be doing. And so when the winds shift and ESG is quote unquote dead, then they're the ones to first pull all their stuff off the shelf, because it wasn't really this sort of process of, I see intrinsic value in doing this as a strategic initiative from within a firm. It's much more, seems like we should be doing something about this. Let's copy and paste from X company and Y company. So I think there's a bit of that going on as well, which sort of ties back to my first point about I'd rather a company make sort of locked in, resilient, incremental change than just sort of be saying things because they think it's what they should be doing, because it's not going to actually result in genuine progress once the headwinds shift and it's no longer sort of an environment that's favorable to that kind of stuff.
So many interesting things in that. Part of me wants to say you kind of want a little bit of that mimicking, to get some movement in a sector, but at the same time, like, how do you make that stick? Right. So, you and I have had that conversation. How do you make incremental change sticky?
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
TBD.
Well, it's got to come from within. The drive to do it has to come from senior level and be properly integrated into the culture of the company.
Excellent. Okay, I want to talk about positive deviance, because you're seeing those leading corporations, right? In a lot of ways, those are our positive deviants. And it's a concept that's at the heart of the study. It's an approach that focuses on identifying what's already working in a community. In this case, Alberta-based og-poo companies are the community we're talking about. So it talks about like what's already working, and then it's about how do we leverage that to encourage broader uptake and replication of uncommon approaches. Ideally, good quality replications, right? That kind of sticks, Colleen, back to your comment. So I'd like to tag the finance folks on the call today. So that's Jamie and Raylene. And we'll start with Jamie. Jamie, we've often talked about this. Had we been able to lock in the incremental change we saw coming out of the sector 5 years ago, companies would be further down the path of transition pathways than they are now. Very much speaks to the volatility of transition pathways and trajectories. So, you've seen the findings. We've had a lot of conversations, but I'm curious from where you sit, where are you seeing progress that we will be able to build on?
Sure. And so I think just to step back a second and think about like what can we learn from that experience. So I think if I do, cast my thoughts back to 5 years ago, Shell, Equinor, BP, Total coming out with what in retrospect were pretty transformative options for an oil and gas company to come forward with, right? Like it was, I thought, it was treated somewhat as too incremental, going back to what Colleen was saying. The market didn't really respond that well to it. Certain investors, activists wanted more. It wasn't enough of a change, wasn't transformative enough. The mainstream market didn't necessarily and see the value of it either. And had we been more receptive, if the market had been more receptive to those steps, I feel like we would undeniably be in a better place right now. Like we would
Mm.
be further ahead and have locked in that change. And even if their ambition hadn't changed in the last 5 years, we'd still based on where we are now. So I think there's something to learn from that, and maybe we'll get into that. But mostly, I think we just have to acknowledge this is kind of fuzzy. Change is going to be hard to forecast. And as going back to my earlier remarks, maybe what we're looking for here is a really solid foundation for resilience that you can grow from, something that sets a floor that is a place you can reach to a higher place afterwards. And maybe that's our focus for now. And so that will probably mean accepting less than perfect. The report does a great job of outlining some of the that companies could take. And so I won't get into those, but instead think about a common thread. And this is picking up on what Colleen just mentioned, which I think was well articulated. It's just there is a mindset here, right? I think the common theme that goes across all those transition companies is a mindset in the first place that allows you to even pursue those transition opportunities when they make sense. I think that is a strategic orientation to these opportunities that if you don't have it, you won't take it. And so I think that is really fundamental to what companies need to have in place. I personally get a little bit frustrated when I hear folks in the industry and even investors respond to the idea of diversification, moving into, you name it, renewables, whatnot, and saying, I'm not in the business of losing money. It's like, okay, but except when you are. Like there is like a history is littered with examples of projects that were way too expensive. And as we look forward into an uncertain time, we're proposing some really big projects with a really big price tag, and they have risk. And so if you were clear-eyed around your opportunities, whether they're in transition or whether, and some will make sense from just a pure, oil and gas perspective. If you were truly looking at these in an objective way, you would be seeking out opportunities that just make sense. And then what I think is really important and what we missed out earlier, going back to Shell, Equinor, and whatnot, is being able to clearly articulate to the market why it makes sense. I don't think we ever got that right. I don't think companies were able to really bring along the market to say this fundamentally makes sense and here's why. So that is a huge piece of this that needs to be done well. And I don't say it's easy. And also just thinking of what Colin said around the mimicry and the mea culpa as investors, that I think we were a big part of that. We put a lot of pressure on companies. And I know when they were reaching out to us saying, what do you want to see? Probably should have been a red flag. Like they should have been telling me what I should be, what's material, right? They should be telling me why this made sense for their strategy and not asking me, what do you want me to say? So in retrospect, it's a bit of a dance. Of course, you want to talk to investors, make sure they're on board. But it felt maybe we didn't get that balance right.
When you talk about articulating this to the market, are you referring to the market rewarding companies for undertaking this type of transition activity, or is there something before that
No,
we need to
absolutely,
consider?
right? Like it's
Yeah.
making sense so that you have your sell side analysts looking at a company and saying this is a company built for the long term and it's going to be resilient and here's why. And I don't think we ever kind of reaction. And as a result, it was really a focus on just do what you do well, which fundamentally makes sense. But I feel like you can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? You can excel in operational excellence for oil and gas, and you can also develop opportunities from a transition perspective.
Yeah. So companies in transition have this ambidextrous nature to how they're kind of managing risk in a way.
I feel yes, right? Like I think it's a sign of real management acumen to see opportunity where opportunity lies.
Raylene, thank you, Jamie. I'm going to turn to Raylene because she's worked directly with a number of companies, including the study. And Raylene, you and I had a lot of tough conversations in the development of the study too. In particular, in terms of the fact that we needed to go beyond hard thresholds to reflect nuance when thinking about the activity denoting companies in transition. Why is this nuance so important? And you mentioned that in your intro comments today.
Yeah, it's a great question. So reflecting back when we were in the development stage of the study, Junan Rao, who I can see is on the call today. So hi, Junan. He was really the horsepower behind doing a very comprehensive literature review on which we based the evaluative framework on. And like as much reading and kind of assessment of these external kind of global frameworks was, I think that development of that framework was very easy in comparison to how we decided to temper it for the Alberta context. So, for example, McKinsey and Company published a global report in 2023, which very clearly said that oil and gas company valuations would benefit when at least 40% of their total portfolio was invested in low carbon assets. So we took that as part of the framework, tested it against some Canadian and international OGPU companies, and some companies met that criteria, but it was only the international ones that were able to pass this framework. So we had to really temper back that 40% for an Alberta context. And I think that's just indicative of where we are as an economy and as a collective in terms of the industry. Scope 3 was also another thing that we had to really think through. In the end, we decided to include it in the framework, but not require companies to show a reduction in their Scope 3 emissions just because the methodologies and the ways of calculating it are evolving. Um, so I think in Alberta context, in order to advance with the study and not propose a framework that none of our companies in Alberta could comply with, we really did have to kind of temper some of the thresholds and in order to kind of bring out the nuances and shine lights on some of the positive deviants. But I think that you know, this is the beginning, I think, of a multi-year study, and I would love to see how companies begin to advance and change, and maybe how we build in factors such as Indigenous rights and interests into this framework. But at the end of the day, if there's no disclosure, it'll be really difficult to assess companies using this framework. And maybe I'll just end with this is really, I think, reflecting hopefully a systems change. That change is dependent on the strategic focus, as Jamie said in his comments, of executive leadership and boards. And I think that EFL has done a wonderful job in shining a light on how the system change is occurring, even though as an economy and maybe as a country, it doesn't feel like we're making advances. There are some very, very clear examples of companies doing really great work in the study. So if our audience hasn't had a chance to take a look at it, I'd really encourage you to do that.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Raylene. I wonder if I can poke for just a second. We've talked about risk for why companies you could think this way, business acumen, et cetera. I'm wondering, like, how critical is the role of leadership when it comes to companies in transition in your experience?
Yeah, that was a question that we had a lot of discussion about during the study. For us, we did not look at this as part of the study, but I think a logical next step would be to look at the executive leadership and how important transitioning is to them personally. Like what was very clear to
Interesting.
me was the um, kind of personal commitment and involvement and strategic um, positioning of the individuals leading companies. Because we did have an example of one company that was really heading in the right direction. But then based on their activities in 2023, they actually kind of stepped back from being an integrated energy actor back to a hydrocarbon actor because they divested their renewables portfolio. So is that down to just the executive leadership which changed? Maybe, maybe not. But I do think there is kind of a personal element to this that is worth looking at. Um, but that's a great next phase for the project.
Hmm. Hmm. So, like, going back to the initial question around nuance, right? Like, you have this world of support, so like sustainability and climate reporting and transition planning, but context matters. right? So you really have to take the context into consideration. And then in that context, you have this critical role of leadership, right? And it goes back to Colleen's comments around the winds of change. And so as soon as a new leader comes in, what are the implications for those trajectories? So thank you very much for all of that. Folks, we're going to be moving to questions from the audience shortly. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But I want to close this portion of today's discussion by drawing a final link between this study that focuses on, as we've said over and over, companies in transition. I want to link that to the current moment we're in. So we have a US administration that has many focus on the financial risk if a trade war unfolds. We have a newly elected prime minister who has the stated goal of making Canada an energy superpower, and that includes both clean and conventional energy. So let's go full circle on this. If we think of companies in transition as those that are starting to diversify, essentially, ultimately to access new markets or to play in different markets, then is this concept of companies in transition off the table? Going back to that first question that I asked Jamie. I'd like to invite everyone to actually weigh in on this one. A sentence or two just to share your final thoughts, and maybe more so speaking to how critical is this concept of companies in transition right now. So sorry, maybe we'll end with Jamie. So maybe Colleen, can you take a first go? Like where are you sitting with this concept right now after today's discussion?
Yeah, and I think it is important to acknowledge it is a complex and tough environment for firms to navigate right now. It's a hard environment for individuals to navigate right now. These are tough times, odd times. But diversification is going to be critical for long-term competitiveness. When we're talking about the sort of dynamics that are happening now, these are often happening on, political cycles, but climate change is obviously a very, very, very long-term risk that will be present long after I'm gone. And so if we're really thinking about what a competitive company is in the long term, they would have to be a company in transition, starting to think about that now. So it shouldn't be off the table. I don't think it's off the table. It may be talked about differently in the current context. You may hear companies speaking more about resilience or risk mitigation, and they may be doing things that they would have been doing 5 years ago under a banner of climate change mitigation, and that's fine for me. I'm not that concerned about that. But diversification, particularly for a jurisdiction like Alberta, we're not the lowest cost traditional oil and gas producer in the entire world. With trade tensions, things like that, we want to be able to access new markets. So, yeah, for me, it's certainly not off the table. Maybe it might just sound different going forward.
So whatever we call it, that there's activity related to transition from your perspective is very much related to longer, like longevity in the long term.
Yeah.
To some degree. Wonderful. Thank you, Raylene.
Yeah, I think Colleen alluded to a thought that I just had. But prior to returning to Canada, I spent the beginning of my career working abroad in Europe and the Middle East and Latin America, and I came home 6 years ago. But prior to returning to Canada, I actually had the opportunity to work with integrated national oil or energy company in the Middle East. And so I had a front row seat to the resources, the efficiency, the talent that these players have in this industry. And to see them even 6 years ago, not even just beginning to transition, but um, putting huge renewable projects through final investment decisions and really building infrastructure in the country, not just to produce their own power, which is renewable, but also to electrify drilling rigs, etc. And then to come back home and to really see our industry, I think, with blinders on and head in the sand, it was a real disappointment. And so I don't know if I have an answer to your question, but I think my question that I often ask myself is how can we continue in this direction in this country? And why are we not hearing more stories about what other countries in the global stage, what they're doing and how they're progressing? And then there's the question about policy and kind of government supports and all of that as well, which I don't think we've touched on to the extent that I think we should have in the report. But there's a huge policy angle as well. And so I don't think companies in transition is off the table at all. I think that if an organization thinks that it is, that's a huge risk, huge risk.
And potentially a very different conversation if we were having this conversation within the global context, right? Like we zoomed into Alberta here, but putting that into the bigger picture, it kind of changes the dynamic in a number of different ways.
Absolutely.
Okay, amazing. Thank you. Jamie.
Yeah, haven't changed my answer. I still think it's
I was hoping you
viable.
would.
And I would just say I think we have to look past this current moment and really look, because I think there is a real business case if you look beyond this very strange time that we're in now. There is a case to be made for companies in transition. And back to what I said before, that business case does have to be made by those companies themselves, though, if we want it to actually stick and resonate in the market. So for those that are thinking about this in a long-term sense, there is work to be done, I guess, to get the market on board with this idea. But it's, to me, to everything that was just said, this is where we're going. Like, I don't know what the option is.
Right, right. And to your point, in terms of how we start today's conversation, whether or not we're leading, right? And we know we're probably going in this direction, but whether or not we're leading is the question that we're trying to grapple with right now. Okay, so I'm going to turn to a couple of questions from the audience. We've got about just a bit over 10 minutes. The first one, Raylene, you put this up, the policy question. So I just want to start there a little bit and open to anyone to respond. But just very curious, how real is the barrier of policy uncertainty when it comes to corporate leadership on transition activity?
Can I go first?
You're welcome to go first.
Yeah, so during our process of undertaking the study, we created the framework to assess which companies could be companies in transition. And then we went through an interview process, which involved sitting down with some of the leadership in these organizations to really understand, the policy element, government supports, etc. And we had some really frank conversations with leadership. They were very frank with us, the importance of having consistent, cumulative policy supports that would influence the um, investments that they would make. So in Alberta, for example, something that came up was just um, the in power and utilities industry, just the changes, and it was very significant, kind of wide sweeping changes that left the company with a lot of fear to really undertake some of the larger projects that they were considering because they weren't sure what that policy landscape would look like in the future. And the changes were just so significant that they saw that as a risk. So I think there is very clearly a policy aspect, but for some reason, the onus seems to be always put on the companies to do the right thing, right? We can't rely on the regulators, we can't rely on the government to really help this along. It's on the onus of the companies, and I really think that you need all three to make advances and to help Canada and Alberta become an energy superpower and to have us have an industry that is truly innovative and making advances. So
Excellent. Any comments or counters from
Yeah,
Jamie
I
or Colleen?
might take a slightly different. I mean, I don't disagree at all. Like, obviously, policy certainty is, I mean, it's fantastic, right? I guess the perspective I would bring is I don't know if we've ever lived in a world where we had policy certainty, and yet we've seen companies take bold actions and get for it, even with uncertainty. And in particular for this industry, where literally like day to day, the price of the product you make changes and sometimes dramatically. Like they are used to uncertainty. Like this is industry that has built itself around a very volatile commodity. So I mean, I 100% think policy is important and it will help us get there faster, better, make it safer for companies to take actions. But I think increasingly this is becoming less and less of a policy issue and more of just a pure economics issue as we look at what is, back to my comments around the disruption and what's driving transformation. It's the alternatives are getting cheaper, they're getting more economic, they are scaling. The innovation compared to where oil and gas, where it's getting harder and harder to find cheap oil, cheap gas, it's just getting more expensive. The opposition is going in the other direction entirely. And if we look at geopolitics, which I think some are looking at that as it's all about energy security now. It's like, okay, if I looked at that and I was a company that was reliant on importing oil and gas, I'd be thinking, how do I get off of this train? If you're really concerned about energy security. So I think that geopolitics thing could go both ways. So I guess what I'm saying is that there are, outside of policy, there is still a lot happening you need to keep your eyes on because that change is going to happen whether government of Alberta makes the right policies or not. So I would just add that it's not really a rebuttal. I completely agree with what Radine said, but I also think it's a little bit of a cop-out to say I'm waiting for policy certainty when I don't think you're going to get it.
Colleen, you came off mute.
Yeah.
That,
I might
oh
just
my goodness, I love it. Yes,
just-
please.
agree with both the, obviously I was involved in the study and that was certainly a finding. And Jamie, I take your point that, yeah, you build an industry around a commodity market that's in flux. You should be able to handle some level of uncertainty. I think in the Canadian context in particular, my mind always goes to, I think a systemic weakness isn't, there's always going to be policy uncertainty and that policies change. They should, that's what government does. But we have really politicized policy making in this country at the subnational and at the national level, compared to other jurisdictions where there's a lot more regulatory independence, a lot more mandates for evidence-based decision making. So this for my 2 cents I wanted to add here is what I would really like to see from government, as opposed to being able to commit to something like a certain trajectory that will never change with policy supports building up over time, is a clear and transparent and certain way that we know how decisions get made when there's new evidence that comes up. Because we're not going to be guaranteed certainty, but I'd like to be certain about how decisions get made, how policy and regulation gets made. And I think that would go a long way in helping firms at least be able to navigate the transition a little bit better, as opposed to having government sort of make policy on political promises. Then another administration gets in and those get changed and we end up, be it carbon pricing or something else. This is where we get this real deterrence of trying to, crowd in more investment into these spaces. So if we could have a system that had more sort of dynamic predictability built into it, not to get too academic, I think that would go a long way in sort of threading the needle here between certainty and uncertainty in the policy sphere.
So if I can summarize this quick conversation, like the uncertainty in the policy space, including how policies are made, isn't helping. But you also can't deny the push and the pull from the economics around the alternatives. That should make you think twice around some of what the actual future of these companies might look like. Okay, but so I think we have time for just one more. We've got a lot coming in, but I'm gonna zoom in onto scope 3. Because I know that is a really interesting space when we talk about companies in transition. Lots of places to have long conversations as the nights get longer. I'm going to summarize this question as what mechanisms are needed to drive scope 3 progress from your perspective?
I mean, I can jump into that to start. I mean, I do think there is a place in here for expectations from regulators around disclosure standards. Maybe that's where you'd put that. I would put one caveat on that is I think just to acknowledge that, yeah, there is a lot of uncertainty around scope 3 right now in terms of the quality of the data and how to assess it and all of that. And I think the line that I always use and I advocate all the time to companies in the sector that they need to be looking at their scope 3 is that it is a very valuable lens to view your business through. And don't get focused on the number and the decimal point and all that stuff, but use it as a lens to view your business and where the risks lay. And I think that is the approach I'd like to see, where it's companies are afraid to put it out there because they can't necessarily justify the number with 100% certainty. And I don't think that's the point. I don't think you can. And I don't know how much time we want to spend trying to get a perfect number. But directionally, you can get a real sense of what scope 3 means for you. And I think that is absolutely something that companies should be able to look at and hopefully disclose, again, creating an environment where they feel safe to disclose that.
Very interesting. So really like building the muscle for scope 3. Raylene, I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, I think there is a real resistance, especially in, I would say, the oil and gas industry, in terms of acknowledging the value of calculating and disclosing scope 3. Not to put one industry kind of under the microscope, but um, I do think that scope 3 has been demonized in a way. Whereas, as Jamie said, it's an indication of where the risks in your organization lie. And I think sometimes in organizations, the individuals calculating scope 3 emissions are either accountants or engineers, so they want to get it with that level of precision. However, it's more the order of magnitude that is important. Um, I'm a believer that, scope 3 will become common practice. I think the methodologies in calculating it will improve. There'll be additional guidance and support and capacity building. But if there was one takeaway for our audience today, it would be don't completely discount it if you don't agree with it. Like look below what the numbers actually saying, and perhaps recognize that the calculation and disclosure of it is offering a different type of information to decision makers to use when they're making decisions in where they invest.
Going back to your initial comments around like perfectionism versus progress on these very important issues. Colleen, any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I think Jamie and Raylene summed it up perfectly. I do think this is where a bit of a stick will come into play and actually needing to mandate some of the stuff. And as Raylene mentioned, that needs to be accompanied by, graduated timelines, capacity building, data support, standardized guidance. But yeah, I think they said it really well. And definitely the focus on sort of the magnitude or the direction, the signal it's giving, as opposed to being scope 3 is complicated. So if we get too bogged down in the decimal points, I think we've lost the plot a little bit.
Like forest for the trees.
Might add on that just like very tangibly something like safe harbor clause, right? If you're going to mandate disclosure, create a safe harbor clause so that you can put this out there and not fear retribution that you got the number wrong.
We've got 2 minutes, and I just have to ask this question because it's so appropriate for a June conversation. So if we can be quick about it, that'd be great. But so we're in barbecue circuit season. So what is the one insider takeaway you would want to share, discuss with your neighbors, your family, or your friends from this report? What is that one thing you want to have a barbecue conversation around? And whoever is ready, go, and then we'll go from there, and then we will close.
I think that when I talk about work I do in sustainable finance to neighbors or something like that, I think the main message I try to get across is that risks presented by climate risk are as material as any other kind of financial risk. So that it's good business to be paying attention to these things. It's not, like my parents might say, a bit of a hippie thing to do.
I'll jump in. My parents definitely don't know what scope 3 is, and that's okay. I would encourage those individuals at the barbecue to really think about their own kind of personal impact in this space, because it is all connected and it's an important part of the systemic change.
The customer in transition, right? Right. Jamie.
I think it's what kind of barbecue you at. What would I focus on? great question. I think to me, what resonates with me, with the community I'm in, is just that we maybe have to have a bit more understanding and comfort with nuance when it comes to what a company in transition looks like. And that's something I take away from the report, is expanding our vision of what is possible, but also not tempering our expectations, but just understanding it's complex.
Yeah. And at a time where everyone wants simplicity, resisting that urge, right? A little bit. Thank you to all of you. This has been a really great conversation to moderate. It really brings home for me this notion of it's a journey, you know, companies in transition is a journey. It's not right now an end state. And it just raised a lot of like what if questions. Like what if we had this analysis within a global perspective of different activity happening there? What if we had this conversation 5 years from now? What if we were able to look at more than just the emissions commitments to other things like the Indigenous rights and title that needs to be part of this concept of companies in transition. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for the audience that joined us today. You have all been excellent and great for participating, and I wish you all a very amazing week. More to come.